God said, let there be light in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night.
I think some of you may already know Martin Postle because he lectured here on Reynolds.
I did.
A few years ago for the Reynolds 300th anniversary. Not only is he an expert on basic Wright of Derby, of which we will hear more later, he also is a very formidable exponent of Reynolds's art, having been a curator at Tate for many years and had the most fantastic show called The Creation of Celebrity about Sir Joshua Reynolds in 2005. Subsequently, Martin moved on to the Paul Mellon Centre, where he spearheaded some absolutely fantastic major research projects, and really culminating in the Wright of Derby, because you're also writing a catalogue raisonné, which is due out in 2028. The talk this morning should be fascinating. It was designed to coincide with the exhibition at the National Gallery, and that's until the 10th of May. And it seeks to portray Wright rather than just as a stock figure of the Enlightenment, which everybody's recognising for, but to kind of draw out more sombre themes of light and shade and dark and depth. But having said all that, I'll let you write.
My interest in Wright of Derby at the moment is very unhealthily intense, it has to be said. It's a project I took on 5 years ago, and I was talking to my colleague Mark Hallett at the time, and I just finished a big project on the Country House, it's an online publication. And he said, well, what would you like to do next? Knowing that next is probably going to be the last major thing that I did at the Mellon Centre. And I said, well, there's one artist I haven't really tackled in any depth at all, but whom I deeply admire, and that's Jose. And he said, what would you like to do? And I said, I'd rather like to catalogue all his oil paintings and do a catalogue raisonné. So it's an in-depth catalogue of all the subject pictures, all the landscapes, all the portraits. And that's what, apart from the other bits and pieces I've been doing over the past 5 years. And the book itself will be published. I'll say a bit more about that at the end of this talk, about what it entails and what writing a catalogue is all about. I'll talk a little bit about that. There is a show on the National Gallery at the moment, which I suspect most of you have seen. It's a display of, there are not many pictures, but they're extraordinary pictures. There's about 16, 17 of them, I think. And of those, I would say 90% of them come from Derby. It's basically Derby's collection has come to London. So it's very generous of Derby to lend them, and it's very good of the National Gallery to give him this spotlight. But I intend to talk about this morning, there's a lot more to write than candlelight. A painter of light and a painter of darkness. There is more to that than just the paintings, because Wright is a deeply, I think, ambiguous artist. Understudied in many ways, misunderstood, often catchphrases like artist of the Enlightenment, proto-industrial revolution, or kind of bandied around about Wright. But beneath that, there is an extraordinary mind at work. At times a very troubled mind, and I think the light and darkness relates not only to the paintings, but to the psyche and the mind of Wright. Well, of course, he's been dead for some time, but reading his letters, looking at his works, seeing how he worked with other people, his friendships, very deep friendships with a number of people in his social and his intellectual community, you get a figure of a man who is quite troubled at times. Yeah, his output is relatively large. It's not as big as Joshua Reynolds. There's about 2,000 of those. Wright, I've catalogued about 750 pictures, but that's excluding copies and versions. But there were times when Wright was simply incapable of painting. Months and months on end, he would say, I can't do anything. I can't paint. I can't lift a brush. And he would say that to his closest friends. So he was dogged by something. Whether it was the black dog, depression. He was somebody who, within certain circles, made friends easily. He had a very interesting circle of friends and acquaintances, including remarkable people like Erasmus Darwin, just to mention one, who was his doctor, but also his close friend. I'm going to talk about the paintings of by candlelight to start with, and then I'm going to branch out and talk about some other aspects of Joseph Wright. Well, this picture that I'm showing you to begin with is the one, I suppose, that everybody now knows today. It's in the National Gallery. It's been there since 1863. But even then, it's had a kind of curious life. I'm fascinated by the life of paintings, where they go, where they live, who sees them, the provenance of paintings. This entered the collection in 1863, as I say. It was then shown at South Kensington, what is now the V&A. Then it was shipped off to Derby. It was on a long-term loan to Derby for a while. It was not a cherished painting. And when Benedict Nicholson, who I'll come back to later, wrote his book in 1968, he said, there is, I think, a great masterpiece there, but we can't really see it properly, because at that time, even in the 60s, it was covered in gunk and dirt, and it was much darker than we see it. There was more dark than light in an experiment in the Airpump in 1968. In 1968. He exhibited at the Society of Artists in 1768, because of course at that time there wasn't a Royal Academy. That was founded until 1769. His first exhibition wasn't until 1769. It's a big picture in the National, you all know it. It's about 8 foot by 6 foot, so it's even bigger than that screen. Quite an undertaking for a man in his mid-30s who, at that time, had very little experience of this type of painting. I'll talk a little bit about his training in a while. He had difficulty selling it. It wasn't a commission. It wasn't as if somebody said, could you just paint me this picture and I'll pay lots of money. He painted it of his own volition, and I'll say more about who was working with him on it. And he eventually found a buyer in a man called Dr. Benjamin Bates, who's a very interesting, curious character, who is a medical doctor, but also a rather colourful character. He was a friend of a number of people that were rather dubious, shall we say. He was one of the monks of Medmenham, Hellfire Club, and that sort of thing. He travelled a lot. He had exotic tastes. He had lots of money. And eventually, a few years later, he offered Wright some money for it. So I'll give you £150. Wright accepted it because at that time he needed the money. Nearly 1770s, he had various debts to pay off. He wanted a lot more, and he said to Bates, look, I'll give it to you. You can pay me £150, but I'm going to write a receipt for 200 and something because I don't want people knowing you've got a bargain. And so it had a curious kind of life and an afterlife. People have written a lot, quite understandably, on modern art historians about exhibition culture. What did people think? What did they see? What did they say? Well, actually, if you read what people said at the time, there's actually very little. It's very difficult to gauge how this picture affected people in the later 1760s. It was only shown in public for about 2 months at the Society of Artists. So relatively few people would actually have ever seen this picture. And then it disappeared into Bates's collection for about 100 years or so. So how people knew the pictures were through the engravings. And in many ways, the engravings were an integral part of these candlelight pictures. All the major, and you've seen, most of you who've been to the National Gallery would have seen there's a whole wall of mezzotints in the exhibition. It was the prints that people saw, it was how they knew them, it was how they were mediated. And the interesting thing about mezzotint engraving, of course, it's a plate which works from dark to light. You start off with it. If there was no work done on the plate, it would be completely black. And then the mezzotint, the engraver, rubs out areas until areas become light. So it's a movement from dark to light. It's excellently adapted to fit Wright's painting methods. And I think pretty much all the candle lights that are in the National Gallery show at the moment were made into Mexitins, and that the Mexitin was very much a part of the process. This one was made by Valentine Green, who was a leading Mexitin engraver, but another man who worked on it was a man called William Pedder, who was a close friend of Wright. I'll come back to, I think I mentioned Pedder a little bit later on. So the picture itself, there's a lot of ink being spilled on this picture, and lots of different theories about it. The subject matter ostensibly is relatively straightforward. You have a demonstrator who is in a room with, I'll just pop that to the message, on a moonlit evening. There are 10 people in the picture. There's the demonstrator himself, and a gathering of others, 10 people, as I say, from childhood to old age, some small children, an old man to the right, sort of being contemplative, a pair of young lovers to the left, the man holding the stopwatch timing the experiment, and the hapless cockatoo within the glass jar. I'll say more about that in a moment. It's a picture which often the word radical has been used, progressive, but it was very much steeped in conventions, both painterly conventions. If you think back to the Caravaggio, the Utrecht in particular, artists like Honthorst and Terbruggen. So it comes out in a 17th century tradition. In fact, the Airpump itself was a 17th century invention. This was not cutting edge science or technology, but presenting a modern history painting in a sense from modern life was. And it exists also, and this is what intrigues me, is the different interpretations. One of them that fascinates is its situation within a Christian culture. Some art historians have made the point, and I can take it, some of it I can take on board, that, and they've been very specific and said that, look, well, these characters, you have effectively a trinity. You've got maybe it's like a holy trinity. You've got a father figure, 2 children, and God the Father. You've got, of course, a Christ-like figure, who is the man who is performing the experiment, the demonstrator. And then, of course, you have a Holy Spirit in the form of a dove or a cockatoo. I don't take it quite that literally, but it's interesting that in Christian pneumatology, study of air, that the Holy Spirit is, of course, to do with breath, with air. And that in itself is actually a fascinating thought. So it was a picture that, and what I like and admire about it is that there are still lots of, it's open, there are still lots of questions to be asked about the moment that is being, because it is a picture about a moment. It is a picture about a moment in time. There is a past, there is a present, and there is a future. You're not quite sure what's going to happen within that sort of pregnant moment. People have also talked about the models in the picture. Who are they? Are they real people? Are they people he knew? Are they people he was friends with? Erasmus Darwin has been conjectured is the chap on the right. I don't think that's entirely possible. I don't believe that myself. He was too young at the time. I think they may have been friends in his circle in Derby. He was painted in Derby. But I think the bigger point, more important point, is that these individuals were part of his intellectual world. So Erasmus Darwin, this is a portrait of Erasmus Darwin from around about 1770, the great natural philosopher, and a close friend, as I say, and companion to Wright. Another man was John Whitehurst, who was also based in Derby, who lived just around the corner from Wright, a geologist, clockmaker, and again, an intellectual. Some people have suggested that he is the model for the demonstrator. Again, I'm not sure about that, but more importantly, whether they are physically in the picture, they're there in the hinterland of the picture. They're the people that belong to it. Now, the other thing that links Whitehurst and Darwin, for example, is that they were both members of the Lunar Society. They were lunatics, as they called themselves at the time. That was the society which was founded in Birmingham, Matthew Bolton. But Wright was never a member, but he was very close to the spirit. So the spirit of the Lunar Society is very much there within the painting. You saw the moon outside at the window. So they're very much part of his world and part of his community. As I said, the air pump itself dates back to the 17th century. It was used by prominent scientists, including Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke, sometimes with animals. So it was not new technology. Now, what Wright uses in his painting is a portable air pump, a modern portable air pump, and that's the one in the picture. And we know that's the machine that he was using, a desktop portable air pump. And that was designed by a man called Benjamin Martin, who was a London-based instrument maker. And I've just put a little picture in there on the screen. And that's his tabletop air pump. So new machine, 1766, of the moment. So popular science, but with a serious intent and a serious purpose. I'm not sure you read all the writing on that, but it's interesting because the thing about the air pump, which was kind of compelling, you didn't just mess around with it. You've got a manual, you've got a user's manual, and you had a series of experiments. There's 64 different experiments in the user's manual that you could perform if you were so minded. And it's interesting that there is a particular experiment that is being carried out. And this, I owe this to my colleague Matthew Crass, who I think has probably been, not probably, definitely the most interesting scholar to write about Joseph Wright in the last few years. He published his book in 2020, Joseph Wright Painted Hot Darkness. And Matthew has shown, I think I believe him, that it is experiment number 42 that is being shown here. As the animal lies prostrate and apparently dead upon the plate of the pump, yet if you let the air in time, or before the action of the heart ceases, it will soon discover signs of life. The body heaves, the legs start out, and by and by the animal begins to rear itself up and to walk or fly about. That's pretty much what's going on. And then the next sentence is equally compelling or more compelling. By these experiments displaying there is such a thing as temporary death. It's temporary death. The bird is not going to die. The bird is not going to expire. There is a God in nature. So it's not a question of, and I don't buy the idea this is animal cruelty going on. Of course, the cockatoo might disagree and say, well, that's not it's all easy to use that. But it's like, the before has sort of putting the swords through the box with the lady inside, and she's the one taking the risks, not him. Unless he gets it wrong, they're both in trouble. But a temporary death, the moralist, and of course Martin wasn't just a man who made instruments, he was a philosopher. He was somebody who's a natural philosopher, like Darwin, and there was a moral dimension to this. Absolutely. So that's the fascinating kind of element it's more than a party trick, it's more than a game. And that temporary death was something that concerned a lot of people in the 80s. They lived with death, of course. We live with death, sadly too. But that moment between life and death, people were of course terrified of being buried alive at the time, that haunted by that. And it's haunting because of that in many ways. And that's Benjamin Martin, his calling card from Crane Court in Fleet Street. So he has a role in the picture, and he's invisible, but there's a role. There's other things going on in this picture too. This is another experiment that is happening within the picture. There's a jar, and there's an object in the jar floating around. Now, people have had different thoughts about what is this object in the jar. Often it's said, it was claimed for the first time by a man called William Schuckbach, who worked at the Wellcome, who I knew of old. He identified it as a skull. He said it's a diseased skull. And of course, because of that, people began thinking of skull, vanitas, mortality, etc., and so on. So that's one possibility. Matthew Crass has proposed another idea, and he said actually he thinks it's a fleshy organ, it's a piece of flesh that's in there, and I think he's probably right. It does look like a skull, somewhat, could do, but he says there is no There are no experiments with skulls of this nature at that time. You can't find anything, but you can find experiments with flesh. And there's a man called Thomas Wright who carried out experiments of this very nature using an air pump, of withdrawing the air from the water and then using the air pump to suck even more. That's why the bubbles, Matthew says, are actually emanating. You can see them winking around the brim. So lots to think about, lots to cogitate upon. And there's, as I said, that could kind of go in that direction myself. Wright was interested himself in natural philosophy, in alchemy, if you want to call it. This is another fascinating work in the exhibition from 1771, The Alchemist in Search of the Philosopher's Stone. And again, like the experiment with an air pump, there's a present, but there's a past. And this is clearly set in the past. This is in the, whether it's the medieval past, we don't know. It's in the vault of a medieval structure. You can see the window, medieval window, and the moon shining through. And it's a moment of revelation. The man is in search of the philosopher's stone. He discovers phosphorus. So again, this tunes in with the interests of Wright's colleagues. There's a man called Matthew Turner, who was based in Liverpool, who had an influence on Wright at the time. He was doing chemical experiments, and he was in turn associated with Joseph Priestley, who, of course, we know, obviously, an individual who discovered oxygen. So there's this very lively kind of spirit of inquiry. Okay? Now, why does Wright read this picture in the 1760s? There is one individual who is absolutely key. And if Wright had not met this individual, I think it's fair to say there would be no experiment with an air pump. That picture simply Wright would not have made it. And the individual in question appears in the experiment with the air pump. Is the man in profile to the left. And his name is Peter Perez Baudet. And he's a fascinating character. And there has been, to date, very little recognition of his role. There's a scholar in Derby called Stephen Leach, who's just written a biography of Peter Perez Baudet. And he is an extraordinary character. As I said, he appears as the lover in this picture. He's also the subject of this portrait, double portrait that Wright painted in 1765 of Peter Perez with his first wife, Hannah. I think it's fair to say, I don't know how many of you remember the Wright show, the National TED in 1990. I'm sure some of you, I remember seeing it, I was a bit younger then. And I remember seeing this picture, in particular this portrait, and going, my goodness, that's extraordinary. That is an extraordinary double portrait because it's so kind of unconventional. It's so lively, there's so much verve. The relationship between the couple is at least amusing. He's almost sort of challenging this character. Baudet had come to Derby in 1762 to survey the county. He was a surveyor. He was also an artist. He dealt in gems. He was a kind of international traveller. And I'm pretty sure that in this portrait, the agenda is set by Baudet. You can see where it is. It's in the National Gallery in Prague, and it's the reason it's in Prague is Baudet left England in 1774. He travelled across Europe. He became involved in military engineering, and he married again after his first wife died, and he eventually settled in Prague, and the picture settled in Prague. And it doesn't make an appearance in the UK very often, but it is quite extraordinary. He's a kind of Barry Lyndon sort of character, something in the sense. He's got that kind of there's more to him than meets the eye. And it's he that really persuades Wright that he can do more than paint conventional portraits. And it's he who kind of encourages Wright to explore candlelight subject matter in the 1760s, beginning with this picture, 3 persons viewing the Gladiator by candlelight of 1765. And again, Baudet is actually at the heart of it. He is the model for the man in the centre. And in this picture, the whole nature of dialogue is around classical antique sculpture, the gladiators, this renowned statue. The models of the young artist to the right is often said to be right, but I've never found it a massively convincing kind of depiction of Wright. I do wonder about that, but that's by the by. So this picture is his first outing in that nature. Candlelight is bought by Benjamin Bates again. So this is Bates purchases this picture. So there is this, beyond the exhibition or the audience, wider audience, there is this closely knit community, and it's clear that Burdett is giving Wright the confidence. I mentioned his lack of confidence, this slightly kind of febrile nature to Wright's nature. Burdett saying that you have the technical skills to do some really interesting things. And then this picture of 1766, the philosopher giving that lecture on the Orrery, in which a lamp is put in place. So this is the big tour de force that belongs to Derby Art Gallery that entered their collection in 1883, thereabouts. Now, this picture was commissioned. This was a commission by a man called Washington Shirley, who was 5th Earl Ferrers. And at that time, Burdett was the secretary to Ferrers. He worked for Ferrers. So the two of them together asked Wright to produce this picture. Ferrers had been an admiral in the Royal Navy. He was elected as a fellow of the Royal Society. And it was owing to his observations of the transit of Venus that he was made fellow of the Royal Society. And in a sense, that's the backstory to this picture. It's a very personal story. Ferrers owned an orrery. He had an orrery in the grounds in the building in his house. And I would like to think that this picture probably hung at that time in Ferrers's domain in his house. So it's, again, very specific, very localized, both physically and in terms of the community it served. So here we have this extraordinary character, Peter Perez Burdett, in his different roles in the Airpump, in his portrait, in the Gladiator, and then in the Orrery itself. So there is this community, as I said. Perez is an artist. Wright produces this series of wonderful pastel portraits, character studies in the 1760s, sometimes of himself. This is a self-portrait with a fur cap from about 1765, and the other has been identified, I think correctly, as Burdett, a man in a turban. It's beautiful little chalk on paper. So examination of self, of others, of friends, characterization, and they're very exotic, they're very romanticized images, looking back to the whole idea of a kind of proto-romantic, what I call it, personification of individuals. And that's what's happening in these pictures, both in the big subject pictures and in the studies. Now, the artist that Wright was influenced by at that time, and Burdett, was a very interesting character called Thomas Fry, who actually died in 1762. But he produced this whole series of large Mexican heads. He was a portrait painter, he was an engraver, and he produced this series, which are stunning, both technically and in terms of their characterizations. So I'm going to show you two of them. These are both examples from the British Museum. And you can see, I'm sure, that by looking at these, that sort of characterization of character studies ultimately is looking towards pictures like the experiment on the Airpump. Here's a good example where you've got Thomas Fry, portrait of a man in profile, turning his head, and then you've got a boy in the experiment on the Airpump adopting exactly the same pose. Just one other example is Fry's depiction of a man leaning on the staff, and then a head of an old man from the experiment, the birds on the Airpump. So that's kind of thing. Because somebody was asking me the other day and said, well, are there any very large sketches by Wright for these extraordinary complex compositions? And the answer is there may have been, but there seem to be very few. Was he painting directly onto canvas? There are drawings by Wright, but most of the drawings are fairly standard landscape drawings. There's some early academic drawings, but there are no compositional sketches or studies. So whether he was sort of placing these figures within a composition. We know that Burdett was working with them. We know in their correspondence that Burdett would give advice. He was also an expert architectural draftsman. So there is that kind of thing. Okay, let's move on. Two girls decorating a kitten by candlelight. We know it because it's here. It's in Kenwood. It's been here for quite some time. Excitingly, very recently, a scholar identified, I think for the first time, the pendant picture, the companion picture to it. There had been questions over, we knew it was one of two pictures exhibited at the Society of Artists. And then an art historian called Julia Seaman, who's written an article in Burlington recently, said, well, actually, we can prove that it's this picture that's now in Getty, two boys with a bladder. That is the companion. I don't need to go here in the time that we've got into the whys and wherefores, but it has proved. They were identified as being displayed at the Society of Artists in 1767. And you can see, when you see them together, you can see how they do actually act on one another. I'm not going to talk in detail about these pictures, but you're very familiar with the decorating of the Kidney Park candlelight. I'm hoping, I imagine, but I don't know, I may be speaking out of turn, that the picture at Kenwood may be joining the boys with the bladder at Getty later in the year. There's an exhibition at Getty in late autumn. I'm not privy to that information, but it'd be nice to see them back together again. What's also interesting about these pictures, they were purchased by the same individual in 1767. And it was an aristocrat, it was the Earl of Exeter who bought them. We know they were in his house in Burley in Lincolnshire, because they were seen there in the late 1760s. He sold them quite quickly in the early 70s. He sold them at auction, and they disappeared into two separate collections. One was bought by Lord Palmerston, the boys, and the other was bought by the Earl of Warwick. And that was the end of it, and they never saw each other again. So these pictures were then strangers. Two pictures which remained together of the same period and still in the same collection are these two. Two boys fighting over a bladder, 1768, and a girl reading a letter by candlelight. These are in the exhibition at the National Gallery, and those you who've seen the exhibition will have seen them. They're actually on loan from a private collection, but they have remained in the family, and they're now being loaned on loan to Derby Art Gallery. So that's where you'll find them. Again, it's looking back, obviously, at Dutch 17th century painting. There is an allegorical aspect to this, I'm sure. Again, it's not just about two boys fighting or teasing or being cruel to one another. Pain and pleasure, the pleasure of reading, the pleasure of love, the pain that the two boys are exerting upon one another. And these were actually bought by a friend of Wright's. This man, or the man in the portrait here, Thomas Coltman. This is a portrait in the National Gallery. Coltman was a close friend of Wright. He bought these little fancy pictures, but he also commissioned a portrait of himself and his wife. This one now to the National Gallery from the collection. Very different. I mean, we're now going to move on from candlelights, not entirely, but to different sorts of pictures. Wright was a very adept painter of a whole range of subjects apart from candlelights. This is a relatively small scale conversation piece of Coltman and his wife on their estate in the early 1770s. I'm showing you a detail of his breeches on the right. Why would I do that? Have you noticed, and I think you can see it without me needing a stick or a pointer, that on his thigh is the imprint of a coin on his right leg and underneath his buckskins. That's a funny thing to do. It's has to be a joke. I don't know whether it's because at the time it was noted that he had married an agreeable young lady with a handsome fortune. I think there's something going on here. It's a bit like Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. There are some things that are just between these people that we'll never quite know. I think Wright can be quite witty, and he's actually standing in the pose of Melian, classical statue, who of course is a hunter. So he's a hunter in all sorts of sense. He's hunted down a very attractive, financially attractive wife on his estate, and he's very well to do, and he's doing very well himself. Wright presented him with his own portrait. And this is the portrait that now belongs to Derby. I think it's an extraordinary portrait. And this is about Wright as a first-rank artist in every way. Excuse me, when he produces work like this, self-portrait, it really is a tour de force in so many ways. This is himself as a working, practicing artist, but also in very romanticised form. It's lovely, we've got burnt orange coat that he's wearing, grasping his full crown, as if he's just stepped out of an academy himself. On the back of it is this. On one side is the self-portrait, and on the other, this is studied for an experimental bird with an air pump. And so they're on the same canvas. They must have been conceived around the same time. It's interesting. That experimental aspect comes about both in the self-portrait and in the other. It was at this time that he also produced two versions of another extraordinary composition, carried by lamplight, which one version on the left was, you may remember, you may not remember, but it was auctioned at Sotheby's in 2017. I fetched about £8 million at the time. I'm giving anything away by saying it may be coming onto the market again. I saw it just the other day, and I think that's the first version. I think he painted that version in the autumn of 1768, around the time he painted the self-portrait. And then he painted another version, which is now at Yale, and I think that version was the one that was exhibited at the Society of Artists. It was actually one that was sold. It was commissioned, and it entered a private collection, and eventually it found its way to Yale. I'm conscious of time, so. Wright recorded his works and various lots of other things in an account book, which is now in the National Portrait Gallery. That's the original. It's hard work to figure out, because he's all over the place. He's not Joshua Reynolds. He's not this kind of. It's sometimes you'll record things, sometimes you won't cross them out. He's crossed them out because it's not painted them and so on. But that's a record of just what I've been talking about. The Orrery's there, the Airpump's there, the outcomes. He's making good money. He's making good money, but he's working hard for it. I mean, there is a writer, that's kind of the sort of person right here. He believes in value for money. He will work extremely hard for it. He's proud, he's independent. He's very suspicious of people in London, in the metropolis. He likes to be situated in Derby. He is Joseph Wright of Derby. He's called that from the 1760s, and he relishes that idea. He finds the academy a difficult environment. He never becomes the full Royal Academician. He's always an associate till the day he dies. And he's slightly resentful of that. He's rather like Stubbs in that respect. He sort of states, portraiture is the mainstay of Wright's art. Okay? So, and that's what we tend to look at. There are more, having catalogued everything, there are more portraits. Portraiture is the thing that he does, he makes money from. Starting from the late 1750s into the 60s, these are quite typical. William and Elizabeth Pigott, 1760, Doncaster. He's a very fine, accomplished drapery painter, and the people who he paints for appreciate drapery because often they're manufacturers. This man's a textile manufacturer, so he's got to look his best, as does his wife. You paid 12 guineas for these, 12 guineas for him, 12 guineas for her. He's trained by Thomas Hudson, the same person that trained Joshua Reynolds. What's interesting about Wright is just how quickly he moves on, how quickly he develops his portrait style. This is one of my, I love this portrait. It's Sir George Cook from the Nelson Atkins. It's funny, and I put it deliberately. Reynolds, there's Reynolds as Marquis of Granby, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army Horse Guards, and then you've got Sir George Cook, who's a squire, who's bought a commission. He's a cornet in the army, and Wright pays him as he sees him. The uniform is, slightly feel he's not a war hero. I think I can say that now without offending anybody. Why is in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City? Very straightforward reason. They didn't know it was by Wright of Derby. They thought it was by John Singleton Copley, and they bought it. American artists, same vintage. They thought they'd got a copy. They got a Wright of Derby. And there you go. Wright, by the late 1760s, has developed a much more sophisticated way of painting portraits. And you don't need me to explain why. The whole visual vocabulary, the poses, the informality. But there's also a kind of crispness to Wright's painting. He's a wonderful technician. I picked these out because they're wonderfully virtuosic in their own right, but they demonstrate really how he had cornered his own market for kind of northern squirearchy. Fleetwood, Hesketh, Francis Hesketh, moneyed middle class landowners, estate owners, and you can see why Wright would appeal to them. There's a kind of no-nonsense aspect to these portraits. Wright goes to Liverpool. They're from Liverpool. These guys are from Liverpool. He makes a lot of money in Liverpool in the late 1760s, and not always from very nice people. And of course, the S word comes up. These are slave traders. Richard Gildart, Thomas Stansforth, they would have known each other well. They wouldn't have seen themselves as we see them. We have to remember that. They were also philanthropists. They founded hospitals, they founded schools, they put money into churches, but they were slave traders and they made a lot of money from it. And Wright was very aware of that fact. It's not, oh, did he know? Of course he knew absolutely what was going on. And he knew Richard Gildart was probably the richest man in Liverpool. He was the first portrait he painted. I'm going to turn that to landscapes and then wrap up. This is his first pure landscape. Extraordinary. 1772. It's a private collection. Still belongs to the family who paid for it. It's big. It's pure landscaping. I mean, just like Corday. I mean, it's except that you can barely spot them on the bottom. Move away for a moment. There. Or three little banditti. The elocution of banditti. Look at all the way. If I'm honest, if it was my picture, I'd get rid of them. Right, any favours. It's a wonderful piece of geology. And of course, his friend was John Whitehurst. It's the Derbyshire landscape. It's a pure evocation of Derbyshire landscape. And this accomplished feat of landscape painting and topography, as you will find. Wright moves to Italy for 2 years in 1774-75. And there, yet again, there's another Wright emerges. And it's a Wright who paints extraordinary landscapes. This is in the tape, Vesuvius in eruption. I think I proved to my satisfaction, and I hope to others, and I can't dwell on it here, this was painted in 1774. It's often said it was painted later, but I've found out enough evidence in correspondence that this is the big picture he produced in this. Now, there's one problem. He never saw the Vesuvius erupt. He kind of says he does in letters. Oh, yeah, it was amazing. He didn't see it erupt. It simply wasn't erupting at that time. It's a fiction. So, but does that matter? It's about the experience of the force and the violence of nature. So it takes us back in a sense to the candlelight. It's about what the power of nature, the force of nature, the source of nature. And this actually only emerged into the public eye just at the time of the 1990 Tate exhibition. It had been in the private collection for donkey's years and nobody knew it. So you've got paintings of volcanoes, you've got paintings. This is a Girandola firework display, which you have T there, Castel Sant'Angelo, 1775, 70. So that was painted for a northern textile manufacturer. It's now in Liverpool Museum. It's, again, this tour de force of light and darkness. These were painted for the same man, very late in his career. Landscape goes on in the rights of, this is a series of 2 or 4 times of the day that he painted in the late 1790s. Night, and the other one, I think this is an evocation of the noon, but I could be wrong, it could be morning. And his great patron period, that time in the 70s, was Catherine the Great. And she purchased 3 pictures from the time. This one, which is an eruption of Mount Vesuvius with the procession of Saint Januarius's head, again, Wright had never seen it. He hadn't seen the procession, but there are other people who have, including Sir William Hamilton, who wrote an account of Saint Januarius's head being held in procession when Vesuvius erupted. You know, as soon as, let's say, Januarius, his head comes out, ooh, it all goes calm again. Bring the head out and the gods are placated. He also painted this iron forge for Catherine the Great. Then painted for Catherine the Great. She bought it. They never met each other. They never met. It was all done through international diplomacy. And this was in the Hermitage, so sadly we probably won't be seeing it anytime soon. Nature, again and again, whether it's a portrait, whether it's a landscape, whether it's a candlelight, is really at the heart. He is the nature lover, so are his friends. Sir Boothby, poet, squire, gentleman, the man who published Rousseau's autobiography. You know this picture, it's in the Tate Gallery. It's an extraordinary kind of innovative idiocy. And that's the thing about Wright. Difficult to pigeonhole, to put him in a particular niche, because there's often changing aspects, but responding to particular individuals and their lives and their life histories. Or this picture in Derby, the Reverend Hughes Cook and his wife Hannah, and Daniel Parker Cook. Daniel Parker Cook is the man in the sort of fawn coat sitting at the table, and the Reverend Hughes Cook, wonderful name, is the man. He's the sort of mansplaining figure. In case Hannah doesn't quite get it. He's obviously planning out his estate and his landscape, just giving her an encouraging kind of hand around the shoulder. But again, these are close friends. This is his world within the environments of Derby. And well, of course, I couldn't give a talk about there's Wright without Richard Arkwright. This is still in the private collection. It's on loan to Derby. The barber's son from Bolton, who became the greatest manufacturer on the empire towards the end of his. And this wasn't commissioned by Arkwright. It's commissioned by his son. No messing with Sir Richard Arkwright. That's me, that's my machine, even though people say, well, actually, you didn't invent it, you just kind of stole the idea, and so on. But this kind of wealth that Wright caught in Wright's cotton, it was all about Arkwright, it was all about his cotton mills. This is a rather sad life, unfortunately. It's a bit battered, but it's still in a private collection in Derbyshire, which is where I saw it and where we took this image of it. His son, his grandsons, the wealth percolated down through the family. These are portraits that commissioned at the same time. These are Richard Junior's sons. This is Richard Junior, his wife. And again, a lot of these pictures are still in private collections. One other individual who was very important as a patron to Wright was Josiah Wedgwood. The other painting Wedgwood's portrait, but Wedgwood commissioned a number of history pictures from him, including this one, which is again only emerged in the fairly recent years, Penelope unraveling the web by lamplight in the 1780s. That's now in the John Paul Getty Museum. He had there's a lot of correspondence between Wright and Arkwright and Wedgwood, I should say. Wedgwood was, should we say, slightly difficult patron in terms of what he wanted. He would tell Wright what he wanted and what he certainly didn't want. And one thing he had a problem with was nudity. So naked figures, maybe not. So basically, that's why this chap has his back turned to you, and you've got to be careful. You pay attention, pay heed in patrons. So let me just finish off a few minutes. What am I up to? I'm writing a catalogue resume of the entire oeuvre of Wright. I'm following a lead, in a sense, taken in 1968 by Benedict Nicholson, who produced this 2-volume work that we published called the Paul Mellon Foundation in 1968. In a sense, I've had a great time over the last 4 or 5 years, mainly looking at works, writing a lot, looking at provenance, looking at attributions. Again, that's what it's going to look like. That's just my idea of it. It doesn't exist. I don't think if you're remotely interested in buying it, you can't, but in a few years' time, if it falls. So yeah, that's what it's gonna. That's just my idea. I haven't even talked to the editor, but I like that. It's in Derby Museum, and I took a picture of the complete catalogue. So what do? I look at absolutely everything. I look at versions, I compare pictures. This is a good example. One of these pictures is by Wright. One is a copy by Wright, a picture by Wright, and one of them is by a friend of Wright. I just give a hint from left to right. You've got Wright, copy by Wright's friend. Okay, and I know that I won't bore you, but I kind of figured it out by looking at the picture, looking at the correspondence. The picture on the right is by this wonderful man called John Holland. That's John Holland and his wife. This is in a private collection. I think it's the first time they've ever been seen in colour. They belong to a lovely man who died last year. He's in his 90s. He was called Gladwin Turbot, and he's a descendant from John Holland. And I went to see him several times. He was a lovely man, and I looked at his collection. You wouldn't mind him. You wouldn't say. And these are late pictures by Wright. Now, when you see them at a distance, they seem quite crisp. I just want to show you these details. Just the paintiness of these. There's almost with the wife. There's almost a kind of deliberate, out of focus to it. It's when you get closer and personal. And that's why started writing about Wright is looking at thinking about how does he paint, who does he paint. We did a lot of new photography. We're still doing it. This is my friend and colleague Matthew taking photographs of a picture. It's actually a copy of a picture. This one lies in the basement in Dark Art Gallery. It doesn't see the light of day very much. Is it a copy? I'm not sure. But those are the questions you have to ask. Questions of attribution. I'm going to finish off, and I am finishing now, this picture. I came across this in a private collection in Derbyshire. And top secret, but the picture not. But the whereabouts is, and I will not and can't reveal that. But when I saw this picture and we photographed it, I knew I'd seen it before. It's a view of the High Tor in Matlock from the early to mid 1780s. And I had seen something like it, but it was in an old photograph at the Mellon Centre. We've got an archive of photographs, some of them belonging to an art historian called Ellis Waterhouse. And these photographs go way back. They're valuable as records of what a picture looked like at a particular moment in time. And on the flip side, there are lots of annotations by Ellis Waterhouse, which are incredibly helpful because he was immaculate in terms of looking at the history of pictures. And I wondered, am I looking at the same picture? Am I? And then I look close up at the back of my photograph, and then I look at the picture, and can you see the crackleos that give the cracking on the surface? It's exactly the same pattern, especially that circular right in the middle. You see that? You see it Waterhouse. That is no accident. That is, to me, that was obviously the clincher. There are differences. I think there's a bit of foliage being added in the recent past, a bit of tree or a branch, but that's conservation. But what was interesting, from the information on the back of the photograph, I not only knew it was the same picture, but I knew who they originally belonged to. There were enough clues on the back of the photograph to know that it had belonged to a very close friend of Joseph Wright, a man called the Reverend Thomas Gifford. And that's a portrait we painted of Gifford and his wife in the 1780s. If I could ever come back as anybody, I would come back as the Reverend Thomas Gifford. What a life. He was he was vicar. He was I know you shouldn't aspire to these things. He was a landowner. He lived in Staffordshire in a place called Barton-under-Needwood. He was the vicar there. And that's an Needwood forest. But he's also a poet. He wrote about the despoilation of the landscape, the enclosures, the disappearance of ancient woodland, again, nature. And he travelled around with Wright. They went sketching together. They went to the Lake District together. And he lived a long, fruitful life. And then his granddaughter, eventually his wife, his grandson's wife, eventually died in the early 20th century. That was his home, Vauxhall Lodge. Within 10 years, the house was demolished. Everything went. The collection, the house, as you can see there, the floors, you name it. And I don't want to sort of end on a sad note, but I have to in some ways, because the 20th century hasn't been kind to Wright. It hasn't been kind to Derby. It hasn't been kind to Derbyshire. These are 6 members of the Marquis and the Hunt that he painted in the early 1760s. They remained in the same house, the same collection until 1964. Very important early series of commissions. Marquis and the Hunt was given over by the Mundy family to Derby Council as a park, as some way to be enjoyed. Derby Council, in its wisdom, decided in 1964 that, well, they keep the park, but they didn't leave the house. Because what can they do with the house? So, of course, they demolished it. And so Marquis Hall is gone, it was demolished. Wright, Joseph Wright of Derby. What happened to the Derby he knew? Sadly, in the 60s, much of it, he wouldn't recognise Derby. I think his heart would be broken if he looked at Derby today. It's a wonderful city, and it has a lot going for it, thankfully. But in the 60s, it's a different situation. They wanted to do, amongst other things, they wanted to put a ring road around Derby, you might know it. And in order to do that, they had to demolish a lot of buildings, or they decided they had to, including St. Alkmund's, which is the church in which Wright was interred. So they knocked the church down, they took all the bodies away, the bones, and they put them somewhere else. So Wright's tomb was destroyed, along with a lot of other things, sadly. But there's a good side, there's a good side to this story, is that today Wright is represented magnificently in Derby, and the exhibition at the National Gallery is wonderful. But if you really want to see Joseph Wright, you go to Derby, because that's where not just those 15 or 16 candlelights, but lots and lots of other works by Wright, but also his world, his landscape, his townscape, the countryside around it. And that's my colleague, she doesn't know I'm showing this. That's Lucy Bamford, who is a curator of Derby Art Gallery, very studious in front of the Orrery. And she doesn't just look studious, she is studious. This is an exhibition that she's mounted in Derby, which is on at the moment. It's just reopened, life on paper. And it's an exhibition of Joseph Wright's drawings and some paintings. And then in June, the exhibition that's now on in the National Gallery is returning to Derby, its rightful place. Thank you very much.